December 6, 1943, Alexandria Harbor, Egypt. Allied officers freeze with their binoculars. A destroyer approaches from the horizon, but something is catastrophically wrong. The ship has no bow, just a flat concrete wall where the front should be. This is the HHMS Adrias, and it just sailed 730 miles through Nazi-controlled waters in a ship that, by every law of physics and naval engineering, should be at the bottom of the Aegean Sea. The story of how this Greek destroyer lost its entire front section, refused to sink, and completed one of the most audacious escapes in naval history is about to rewrite everything you thought you knew about human determination and engineering ingenuity. October 1943, the Aegean Sea. World War II is raging across every theater, and the Mediterranean has become a deadly chess match between Allied and Axis forces. The British are attempting a bold operation called the Dodecanese Campaign, trying to seize control of Greek islands from German occupation. The strategic prize is enormous. Control of the Aegean means pressure on Nazi-occupied Greece, disruption of German supply lines, and a potential gateway into the Balkans. Into this cauldron of war sails the HHMS Adrias, designation L-67. Now, before we go any further, let's clear something up. The Adrias wasn't some rusted relic limping through the war. This was a modern Hunt-class destroyer, a purpose-built escort and minesweeper commissioned just 2 years earlier. Fast, maneuverable, and deadly, the Hunt-class ships were the workhorses of coastal operations, designed specifically for the kind of dangerous work the Mediterranean demanded. But what made the Adrias truly special wasn't the ship itself, it was the crew. These were Greek sailors operating under the Greek flag, but they hadn't seen their homeland in years. Since the German invasion of Greece in 1941, these men had been fighting in exile, serving alongside British forces with one burning purpose: to liberate their country. Every mission wasn't just a military operation, it was personal. It was about reclaiming their homes, their families, their nation. The Dodecanese Islands, scattered across the southeastern Aegean, had become a focal point of this struggle. After Italy's surrender in September 1943, the British saw an opportunity to seize these islands before the Germans could consolidate control. It was a race against time, and the stakes were enormous. The Germans, however, weren't about to let these strategic positions fall without a fight. They responded with overwhelming force, air superiority from the Luftwaffe, naval patrols, and something even more insidious: mines. Hundreds of them, scattered invisibly beneath the waves, turning the Aegean into a lethal lottery. This is the world the Adrias operated in. Every mission was a gamble. Every stretch of water could hide instant death. October 22, 1943. Night falls over the Aegean. The Adrias is executing a diversionary operation near the island of Kalymnos, part of a larger Allied effort to confuse German defenses and support landings elsewhere. The crew is at battle stations, eyes scanning the darkness, every man aware that German forces control these waters. The tension is suffocating. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and they're done. Then it happens. The explosion is beyond catastrophic. The ship strikes an unknown German mine, and the detonation is so powerful it doesn't just damage the bow, it rips it completely off. The entire front section of the destroyer, from the waterline up, is simply gone, torn away in a single violent instant. The sound is deafening, a thunderclap of metal shearing and water rushing. Men are thrown from their feet. Alarms scream. The ship lurches forward, then begins to list as thousands of gallons of seawater pour into the open wound. For anyone who understands ships, this is a death sentence. The bow isn't just cosmetic, it's structural, it's hydrodynamic. It's what keeps the ship stable, what allows it to cut through water, what maintains the integrity of the entire hull. Without it, the Adrias should flood immediately, the weight distribution should collapse, and the ship should plunge bow first into the depths within minutes. But somehow, impossibly, the Adrias stays afloat. Barely. The crew scrambles in the darkness, trying to assess the damage, trying to understand how they're still alive. Water is flooding the forward compartments. but the watertight bulkheads are holding, at least for now. The engines are still running. The rear two-thirds of the ship is intact. Then the situation gets worse. The HMS Herworth, a British destroyer operating nearby, sees the explosion and immediately moves to assist. It's what any naval vessel would do. You don't leave men in the water. You don't abandon a stricken ship. The Herworth closes in, preparing to take on survivors to offer whatever help it can, and then the Herworth hits a mine. The British destroyer doesn't get the Adrias's impossible luck. The mine strikes amidships, and the Herworth breaks in half. Not damaged, not crippled, broken. The ship literally snaps into two pieces and begins sinking immediately. Within minutes, the Herworth is gone, taking dozens of British sailors with it. The men of the Adrias watch in horror, as their would-be rescuers disappear beneath the black water. Now the situation is beyond desperate. The Adrias is alone, mutilated, surrounded by minefields in enemy-controlled waters. No rescue is coming. The Germans know they're here. Dawn will bring Luftwaffe bombers. Every instinct, every regulation, every piece of naval doctrine says the same thing. Abandon ship. Get the crew into lifeboats. Scuttle the vessel if possible. Save the men. But Commander Ioannis Tumbas doesn't give that order. Tumbas is a career Greek naval officer, a man who's been fighting in exile since his country fell. He's experienced, disciplined, and by all accounts, completely rational. But standing on the bridge of his destroyed ship, staring at the gaping hole where his bow used to be, he makes a decision that defies every rule in the book. We're not abandoning ship. The crew stares at him. Some think he's in shock. Some think he's lost his mind. One officer quietly suggests that the commander might want to reconsider. The ship has no bow. They're taking on water. They're sitting ducks for German aircraft. This isn't bravery. This is suicide. Tumbas looks at his officers, and his response is simple. The engines work. The hull is mostly intact. We're Greeks. We don't surrender our ship to the sea. Then he explains his plan, and it's so audacious, so completely insane, that it just might work. The problem is weight distribution. Without the bow, all the ship's weight is concentrated in the rear, which means the destroyed front section is dipping into the water, creating massive drag and making the ship impossible to steer. Basic physics says they're doomed, but Tumbas proposes using physics against itself. We flood the rear compartments, he says, deliberately. We use the water as counterweight. We balance the ship by making the back heavier, which lifts the front out of the water. It's brilliant. It's terrifying. And it's never been done before. The crew gets to work. In the darkness, with German forces potentially closing in, they begin the controlled flooding of the aft compartments. They're deliberately sinking the back of their own ship, gambling that they can achieve the perfect balance before the whole vessel goes under. Too much water, and they sink. Too little, and the bow stays submerged and they can't move. The water rises in the rear compartments, slowly, steadily. The crew watches the waterline, watches the angle of the deck making microscopic adjustments. And then, impossibly, it works. The destroyed bow section lifts out of the water. The ship levels out. The Adrias is floating, balanced on its own internal counterweight. But they still can't move. The temporary balance is holding, but they need repairs. They need a plan. And they need to get out of these waters before dawn brings German bombers. Tumbas orders the engines to minimum power, and the Adrias begins limping toward the Turkish coast. Turkey is neutral in the war, which means it's not safe exactly, but it's not actively hostile. If they can make it to Turkish waters, they might buy themselves time. The journey is agonizing. The ship moves at a crawl, every wave threatening to upset the delicate balance they've achieved. The crew works in shifts, constantly monitoring the water levels, adjusting ballast, praying the makeshift equilibrium holds. Hours pass. The sun begins to rise. And finally, mercifully, they see the Turkish coastline. They make it. Barely. The Adrias limps into a small Turkish port, and for the first time since the explosion, the crew can breathe. They're alive. Against all odds, they're alive. But now comes the next impossible challenge. They're in neutral territory with a ship that has no front. The Turks are sympathetic. They have no love for the Germans, but they're officially neutral. They can't offer military assistance. They can't provide a shipyard. They can offer shelter, some basic supplies, and time. That's it. Tumbas gathers his officers and lays out the situation. The nearest Allied-controlled port is Alexandria, Egypt. It's 730 nautical miles away. The route goes directly through German-patrolled waters and under Luftwaffe flight paths. They have no bow. They have no escort. They have no support. "We're going to make it to Alexandria," Tumbas says, "and we're going to do it in this ship." The crew looks at him like he's insane. One officer points out the obvious: they don't have a bow. They can't sail 730 miles in open water without a bow. It's not physically possible. Tumbas smiles. "Then we'll build one." What follows is one of the most remarkable examples of improvised engineering in naval history. The crew has no shipyard, no proper materials, no welding equipment. What they have is concrete, wood, scrap metal, and sheer determination. They begin constructing a temporary bow. Not a real bow, not something hydrodynamic or structurally sound by any normal standard. Just a flat wall, a barrier to keep water out. They mix concrete. They scavenge wood from local sources. They hammer together a patchwork seal over the gaping wound in their ship. It looks absurd. It looks like something a child might build. But it's watertight. Mostly. The Turkish authorities watch this process with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. They provide what help they can without violating neutrality. Some tools, some materials, some advice. But mostly, they just watch as this Greek crew refuses to accept the impossible. After days of round-the-clock work, the makeshift bow is complete. It's ugly, it's crude, but it's there. The Adrias now has a flat concrete wall where its bow used to be, and somehow, against all logic, the ship is still floating. Tumbas gathers his crew. He explains the plan. They're going to sail to Alexandria, 730 nautical miles, through enemy waters, in a ship with a concrete bow. And they're going to do it under one absolute rule. They travel only at night. During the day, they'll hide. They'll tuck into coastal coves behind islands, anywhere they can find cover from German reconnaissance aircraft. The Luftwaffe controls the skies, and if they're spotted, they're dead. One bombing run, and this entire mad endeavor ends at the bottom of the Mediterranean. But at night they'll move, slowly, carefully, using the darkness as their only shield. The crew understands the stakes. This isn't a military operation anymore. This is survival. This is a test of will against the universe itself, and every single man volunteers to see it through. They depart Turkish waters under cover of darkness. The Adrias, the ship with no bow, begins its impossible journey. The first night is a test of faith. Will the concrete hold? Will the balance maintain? Will the engines handle the strain? Every man on board is holding his breath, waiting for something to fail. But the ship moves. Slowly, painfully, but it moves. The concrete bow holds. The water stays out. They make it through the first night. The second night brings a new terror. German patrol boats are operating in the area, their searchlights sweeping the darkness. The Adrias cuts its engines, drifting silently, the crew frozen at their stations. The patrol boats pass within a mile, close enough to see if they'd looked in the right direction. But the darkness holds. The Germans move on. The Adrias survives. The third night, a Luftwaffe bomber flies overhead. The crew can hear the engines, can see the silhouette against the stars. They've hidden in the shadow of a small island, hoping the irregular coastline will mask their shape. The bomber circles once, twice, then moves on. Another impossible escape. The fourth night brings a storm. Waves crash against the concrete bow, and the crew hears the sickening sound of cracks forming. Water begins seeping through. Not flooding, not yet, but enough to be terrifying. They can't stop. They can't pull into port. They're in the middle of German-controlled waters. So they work while they sail, mixing more concrete, stuffing the cracks with whatever materials they have, performing emergency repairs in the middle of a storm on a moving ship. The concrete holds, barely. By the fifth night, exhaustion is setting in. The crew is running on fumes. They're rationing food and water. They're taking turns sleeping in shifts, so short they barely qualify as rest. Some men are starting to break down, starting to question whether this mad journey is even possible. Tumbas never leaves the bridge. He stands there, night after night, a constant presence, a reminder that they will not give up. The crew begins singing. Quietly, so as not to carry across the water, they sing Greek songs, songs of home, songs of resistance, songs that remind them why they're doing this. They're not just trying to save a ship. They're refusing to let the war take one more thing from them. Night 6. The concrete bow is holding, but it's developing more cracks. The engineers are running out of materials for repairs. They're improvising with anything they can find, using cloth, using tar, using prayers. The ship is a floating testament to human stubbornness. Night 7. They have a close call with a German destroyer. The enemy ship is running a patrol pattern, and the Adrias is directly in its path. There's no time to hide, no island to duck behind. Tumbas makes a split-second decision. He orders the engines cut completely. The Adrias goes dead in the water, drifting silently. The crew doesn't breathe. The German destroyer passes less than half a mile away. In daylight, they would have been spotted instantly. But in the darkness, they're just another shadow on the water. The Germans sail on, never knowing how close they came. Night 8. They're getting close now. Close to Allied-controlled waters. Close to safety. But the ship is falling apart. The concrete bow is more cracked than concrete at this point. The engines are overheating. The crew is beyond exhausted, but they're close. So close. And then, on the morning of December 6, 1943, they see it. Alexandria, the harbor, the Allied fleet. It's St. Nicholas Day, the patron saint of sailors. The symbolism isn't lost on anyone. Tumbas allows himself a moment of emotion. Then he straightens his uniform, orders the crew to battle stations one last time, and steers the Adrias toward the harbor entrance. The Allied fleet sees them coming. At first, there's confusion. An unknown ship approaching. Then recognition. It's a Hunt-class destroyer. But something's wrong. The profile is off. And then someone with binoculars gets a clear look and freezes. That ship has no bow. The word spreads through the fleet like wildfire. Officers grab binoculars. Sailors crowd the rails. Everyone is staring at the impossible sight. A destroyer sailing into harbor with a flat concrete wall where its bow should be. Someone checks the records. The Adrias was listed as lost weeks ago, presumed sunk after the mine strike near Kalymnos. But here it is, sailing into Alexandria like a ghost ship returning from the dead. The harbor falls silent. Thousands of Allied sailors, from dozens of ships, just staring. The Adrias continues its slow approach, the Greek flag flying proudly from its mast. The crew standing at attention on a deck that shouldn't exist on a ship that shouldn't be floating. And then someone starts clapping. Then another. Then another. Within seconds, the entire harbor erupts. Ships are sounding their horns. Sailors are cheering. Officers are saluting. The Adrias, the ship that refused to die, is receiving a hero's welcome from an entire fleet. On the bridge, Commander Tumbas salutes back, tears streaming down his face. His crew, exhausted beyond measure, stands tall. They did it. They sailed 730 miles through enemy waters in a ship with no bow. They defied physics, defied the Germans, defied death itself. The Adrias docks in Alexandria, and immediately naval engineers swarm the ship. They need to see this. They need to understand how this is possible. They measure the concrete bow. They inspect the flooded compartments. They calculate the weight distribution. And their conclusion is unanimous. This shouldn't work. By every principle of naval architecture, this ship should have sunk the moment it lost its bow. But it didn't, because Commander Tumbas and his crew refused to accept what should have happened. and instead focused on what could happen. The story spreads through the Allied forces like wildfire. Within days, every sailor in the Mediterranean knows about the Greek destroyer that lost its bow and sailed 730 miles anyway. It becomes legend. It becomes inspiration. It becomes proof that human determination can overcome impossible odds. The Adrias is immediately taken into the Alexandria shipyard for proper repairs. British naval engineers construct a real bow, restoring the ship to full operational capability. The work takes months, but it's done right. The Adrias will sail again. And sail it does. By mid-1944, the Adrias is back in action, participating in operations across the Mediterranean. The ship that should have died becomes one of the most reliable vessels in the Greek naval forces. It survives the rest of the war, participating in the liberation of Greece, seeing its crew finally return to the homeland they'd been fighting for. Commander Ioannis Tumbas is decorated by the Greek government in exile. He receives recognition from British Naval Command. But more than any medal, he has the respect of every sailor who hears his story. He's the man who looked at an impossible situation and simply refused to accept it. The crew of the Adrias, those Greek sailors who spent 8 nights sailing through enemy waters in a ship held together by concrete and willpower, become heroes in their homeland. When Greece is finally liberated, they return not as exiles, but as the men who proved that Greek spirit could not be broken, not by occupation, not by war, not even by the sea itself. After the war, the Adrias continues to serve in the Greek Navy until 1945, when it's finally decommissioned. The ship that refused to die is eventually scrapped, but its story lives on. In Greek naval tradition, the Adrias represents something profound, the refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. It's not just about one ship or one crew. It's about what humans are capable of when they refuse to accept defeat. The Adrias should have sunk. Every law of physics, every principle of naval engineering, every bit of common sense said that ship was doomed the moment that mine tore off its bow. But Commander Tumbas looked at those laws and principles and common sense, and he said, "No, we're going to find another way." And he did, not through magic, not through luck, through understanding the problem, through creative thinking, through using the very forces that should have destroyed them as tools for survival. The water that should have sunk them became the counterweight that saved them. The darkness that made navigation dangerous became the shield that protected them. The concrete that seems absurd as a ship's bow became the barrier that kept them afloat. This is engineering at its most fundamental level. Not having the perfect tools or the ideal conditions, but working with what you have and refusing to give up until you find a solution. The story of the Adrias also highlights something often forgotten about World War II. The contribution of smaller nations, of exiled forces, of men fighting far from home for countries they couldn't even see. The Greek forces in exile, operating under British command, played crucial roles throughout the Mediterranean theater. They weren't the largest forces. They weren't the most well-equipped, but they were among the most determined. These were men who had watched their country fall to invasion, who had left their families behind under occupation, who had every reason to feel defeated and powerless. Instead, they fought. They served on ships like the Adrias, they participated in operations across the Mediterranean, and they never stopped believing they would return home. The Dodecanese campaign, the operation that the Adrias was supporting when it struck that mine, is largely forgotten today. It was a British attempt to seize Greek islands from German control, and ultimately, it failed. The Germans held the islands. The British withdrew. By conventional military standards, the campaign was a defeat, but the Adrias's survival transcends that tactical failure. It becomes something larger. It becomes a story about human resilience that resonates far beyond the specific military operation. Naval historians still study the Adrias incident today. It's taught in some naval academies as an example of damage control, creative problem-solving, and leadership under extreme pressure. The technical aspects alone are fascinating. How do you balance a ship that's lost a third of its length? How do you navigate without proper bow hydrodynamics? How do you maintain structural integrity with improvised materials? But beyond the technical questions, there are the human ones. How do you convince a crew to stay on a ship that should be sinking? How do you maintain morale during an 8-night journey through enemy waters in a vessel held together by concrete? How do you make the decision to attempt something that's never been done before, knowing that failure means death for everyone under your command? Commander Tumbas answered those questions not with speeches or grand gestures, but with quiet confidence and unwavering determination. He believed it could be done, and that belief was contagious. His crew followed him not because they were ordered to, but because they trusted him, because he had shown them that the impossible was just the difficult that hadn't been accomplished yet. There's a broader lesson here about how we define impossible. We use that word so casually. Something is impossible when it violates the laws of physics, when it contradicts established principles, when it's never been done before. But the Adrias proves that impossible often just means no one has figured out how yet. The ship violated conventional naval architecture by staying afloat without a bow, but it didn't violate physics. It used physics. It just used physics in a way no one had thought of before. The concrete bow was absurd by traditional standards, but it worked. The journey was suicidal by conventional wisdom, but they survived. This is the power of refusing to accept limitations, not through ignorance or recklessness, but through careful analysis of what's actually required versus what's traditionally done. Tumbas didn't ignore the fact that his ship had no bow. He acknowledged it, understood the problems it created, and then systematically solved each problem with the resources he had available. That's not luck. That's not a miracle. That's engineering and leadership at their finest. The story of the Adrias also reminds us that war is not just about grand strategies and massive battles. It's about individual moments of courage and ingenuity. It's about a Greek crew refusing to abandon their ship. It's about 8 nights of silent sailing through enemy waters. It's about a commander who believed in his crew, and a crew that believed in their commander. These moments don't always make it into the history books. The Adrias' story is relatively unknown outside of Greece and naval history circles. It doesn't have the dramatic flair of major battles. It doesn't involve thousands of troops or strategic turning points. It's just one ship and one crew doing something impossible because they refuse to accept any other option. But maybe that's what makes it so powerful. This isn't a story about superhuman abilities or extraordinary resources. It's a story about ordinary people. Well, as ordinary as any naval crew in wartime can be, facing an impossible situation and finding a way through it. Not because they were special, but because they refused to give up. When the Adrias sailed into Alexandria Harbor on that December morning, it proved something profound. It proved that human ingenuity, determination, and courage can overcome obstacles that seem insurmountable. It proved that the word impossible is often just a challenge waiting to be accepted. The Allied sailors who watched that ship enter the harbor, who saw the concrete bow and understood what it meant, they witnessed something that changed their understanding of what was possible. They saw a ship that should have been at the bottom of the Aegean Sea. They saw a crew that should have been dead or captured. Instead, they saw triumph. They saw proof that giving up is a choice, not an inevitability. This is why the Adrias matters, not because it changed the course of the war, not because it was a major military victory, but because it represents something timeless about human nature. When faced with impossible odds, we have a choice. We can accept defeat or we can find another way. Commander Tumbas and his crew chose to find another way. They chose to flood their own ship to create balance. They chose to build a bow out of concrete. They chose to sail 730 miles through enemy waters in the darkness. They chose to believe that they could make it when every rational analysis said they couldn't, and they were right. The Adrias sailed into Alexandria Harbor on December 6, 1943, and in doing so, it sailed into history. Not as a footnote, not as a curiosity, but as a testament to what humans can accomplish when they refuse to accept the impossible. So the next time you face a problem that seems insurmountable, remember the Adrias. Remember the ship with no bow that sailed 730 miles anyway. Remember the crew that refused to abandon ship. Remember the commander who looked at certain death and said, "No, we're going to find another way." Because the Adrias teaches us that impossible is not a fact, it's an opinion, and opinions can be changed. They laughed at a Greek destroyer without a bow. They thought it was finished. They thought it was a tragic loss, another casualty of a brutal war. Then they froze in stunned silence when that same destroyer sailed into Alexandria Harbor, battered but unbroken, impossible but real. The Adrias didn't just survive. It triumphed. It proved that courage and ingenuity can overcome any obstacle, even the laws of physics themselves. It proved that the human spirit, when tested to its absolute limit, can achieve things that seem impossible. And that lesson, that truth, is why we remember the Adrias, not just as a ship but as a symbol of resilience, a symbol of determination, a symbol of the extraordinary things ordinary people can accomplish when they simply refuse to give up. The ship with no bow sailed 730 miles through enemy waters and made it home. And in doing so, it reminded the world that impossible is just another word for not yet accomplished. That's the legacy of the HHMS Adrias. That's the story that deserves to be told. And that's why, 80 years later, we still freeze in awe when we hear about the Greek destroyer that refused to die. If this story of impossible courage inspired you, hit that subscribe button so you never miss another untold story from history. Drop a like if the Adrias earned your respect, and leave a comment telling us, what's the most impossible thing you've ever accomplished? Let's keep these incredible stories alive together.